December 20th, 1944. An isolated Belgian estate known as Dom Bütgenbach. Out of the freezing fog, the elite 12th SS Panzer Division drives a massive armored spearhead toward this critical crossroads. Digging into the frozen dirt to stop them is a single, vastly outnumbered American infantry battalion. By all conventional military metrics, the heavy German armor should shatter the American lines within hours. Yet, over the next 2 days, the snow around the manor will turn black with the husks of dozens of burning Panthers, stopping Hitler's northern offensive dead in its tracks. How did an inevitable slaughter transform into a graveyard for elite German armor? The story of Dom Bütgenbach is often remembered as a classic tale of American grit, a handful of brave infantrymen standing tall against the Nazi war machine. But that narrative obscures a much colder, much more calculated reality. This was not a victory built on raw, desperate heroism. It was a forensic dissection of an armored assault using brutal, unforgiving mathematics. To dismantle the 12th SS Panzer Division, a premier formation built specifically for breakthrough operations, the men of the 1st Infantry Division didn't just dig deeper trenches. They engineered an airtight killing zone. They synchronized devastating, pre-registered artillery fire plans, integrated their anti-tank assets directly into the infantry screens, and relied on a relentless supply chain that kept the guns firing when they logically should have run dry. This is a story about the absolute limits of a static defense against mobile armor and the precise mechanics required to survive it. Because when 60 tons of steel is bearing down on frozen foxholes, courage alone cannot stop a tank. The central question remains, how exactly did these isolated infantrymen manage to hold their ground against repeated, coordinated armor attacks without simply being crushed under the treads? To understand how this killing zone was constructed, we have to step back to the chaotic opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The spearhead of this massive offensive, the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, was tasked with the most critical objective, punching through the northern sector, seizing the bridges over the Meuse River, and ultimately capturing the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp. But to execute that deep strike, the German mechanized columns needed roads, and they needed them immediately. Within 48 hours, the German timetable was already falling apart. Stubborn American resistance around the Elsenborn Ridge was acting like a massive breakwater, forcing the German armored columns to divert south, congesting their supply lines and stalling their momentum. Desperate to keep their northern breakthrough routes open and flank the Elsenborn defenses, elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, began aggressively probing for a weak seam in the shifting American lines. They found one, pointed directly at the crossroads near Butgenbach. Commanding the defense of this specific sector was the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment, part of the veteran 1st Infantry Division, which had been hastily trucked south from the Aachen sector to plug the collapsing line. At the center of their assigned sector sat Dom Bütgenbach, a sprawling fortress-like Belgian farm estate constructed of fixed stone, surrounded by rolling, open fields. Behind this estate lay the vital logistical arteries that supplied the entire northern shoulder of the Allied defense. If the SS captured the crossroads, they would bypass the Elsenborn Ridge entirely, overrun massive American supply dumps, and blow the northern sector wide open. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Derrill Daniel, understood the brutal mathematics of his situation perfectly. He was commanding a light infantry force sitting squarely in the path of a premier armored division. He had no illusions about stopping 60-ton Panther tanks and upgunned Panzer IVs with rifles and machine guns. If his men were to survive the coming days, they had to turn the terrain itself into a weapon. But the terrain was actively fighting them. Temperatures had plummeted well below freezing, accompanied by a blinding, freezing fog that grounded Allied aircraft and reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. The cold was so severe that the ground had frozen solid to a depth of over a foot. When the infantrymen attempted to dig their defensive positions, their standard issue entrenching tools simply bounced off the earth, snapping wooden handles and bending steel blades. With the mechanical roar of German armor already echoing from the captured village of Bulge, just 2 miles to the east, there was no time for conventional digging. The Americans resorted to using quarter-pound blocks of TNT and Composition C2 explosives to blast shallow craters in the frozen soil, which the men then desperately scraped out by hand to form fighting positions. They did not dig standard linear trenches. Instead, Daniel ordered a defense in depth, a perimeter of mutually supporting strongpoints where the heavy weapons of one squad covered the blind spots of the next. While the riflemen tore into the frozen earth, the engineers and anti-tank platoons executed a masterclass in static defense preparation. They dragged thousands of heavy anti-tank mines into the freezing fog, burying them under fresh snowdrifts along every conceivable approach route. These were not random minefields. They were deliberately designed to channel the incoming German armor away from the thick stone walls of the manor and directly into pre-planned kill zones. To deal with the heavy, sloped frontal armor of the incoming German Panthers, the battalion's towed 57mm anti-tank guns were dragged into defilade positions, specifically angled not to fire directly at the enemy's frontal approach, but to ambush the tanks with vulnerable side shots as they were forced to maneuver through the minefields. Yet, the true centerpiece of the defense was invisible to the naked eye. It was an intricate web of geometry and radio frequencies. Forward observers from the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion climbed into the upper stories of the Dom Bütgenbach manor and positioned themselves on the freezing ridgelines. Looking out over the snow-covered fields, they systematically mapped the surrounding landscape. They plotted every tree line, every draw, and every road junction, converting the terrain into a tight, unforgiving grid of pre-registered target reference points. They did not just link to their own battalion's 105mm howitzers. They tied their radios directly into the fire direction centers of the immense artillery parks massing behind the Elsenborn ridge. They established firing protocols with heavy 155mm batteries and corps-level artillery. By pre-calculating the exact ranges, elevations, and powder charges required for each gun, the observers ensured that the moment German armor entered the grid, the artillery could deliver time-on-target barrages. This devastating tactic meant that shells fired from dozens of different guns at different distances would arc through the winter sky and detonate on the exact same coordinate at the exact same second, maximizing the lethal shockwave and eliminating any chance for the advancing enemy to take cover. For 48 hours, the men of the 2nd Battalion worked in a state of exhausted urgency. Frostbite began to gnaw at their feet. The freezing mist soaked through their heavy wool coats, but they kept laying wire, planting mines, and calibrating firing coordinates. The ticking clock of the German advance dictated every movement. They knew the 12th SS was organizing just out of sight, preparing a massive mechanized fist to smash through their hasty perimeter. By the late afternoon of December 18th, the preparations were as complete as time and the frozen earth would allow. The traps were set, the guns were loaded, and the radios were humming with static. The race against the clock was over. On the following day, out of the dense white mist rolling off the Ardennes forests, the first armored probes of the 12th SS Panzer Division hit the perimeter, testing the edges of the American trap. The morning of December 19th broke with the same blinding, freezing fog. Out of the whiteout, the vanguard of the 12th SS Panzer Division rolled forward. Their commanders were operating under a lethal misconception. German intelligence, fueled by the staggering early successes of the Ardennes offensive, believed the American lines in this sector were in total disarray. They expected to find terrified, disorganized stragglers, a broken rear guard easily swept aside by the sheer psychological shock of advancing armor. The Panzer Grenadiers marched confidently behind a screen of heavily armored Panthers, pushing directly toward the Dom Bütgenbach crossroads. They didn't bother with cautious, methodical infantry scouting. The offensive's rigid timetable demanded speed, and they fully expected to steamroll through the area. But as the German column committed to the open approach, the trap snapped shut. A massive detonation tore through the freezing mist. The lead Panther had struck the hidden minefield, severing its heavy steel track. The tank slewed to a violently abrupt halt, instantly bottlenecking the narrow approach. The armored spearhead was forced to stall, and they had stalled exactly where the Americans wanted them, up in the freezing upper floors of the manor. The forward observers didn't panic or scramble for coordinates. They simply keyed their radios and called in a pre-registered fire mission. The response was instantaneous. Within seconds, the sky tore open. It wasn't a scattered, probing bombardment. It was a perfectly synchronized, concentrated storm of 105mm and heavy 155mm high-explosive shells, detonating directly on top of the stalled German formation. The American gunners weren't trying to crack the thick frontal armor of the Panthers with artillery. They were specifically targeting the soft tissue of the assault. The relentless barrage systematically shattered the trailing German infantry support. Without those Panzer grenadiers to protect the tanks from close-range ambush and boxed in by the invisible minefields, the armor was paralyzed. They could not move forward without hitting more explosives, and they could not deploy their infantry into the blinding storm of shrapnel. In the command half-tracks waiting behind the tree line, the reality of the situation rapidly washed over the SS officers. The immediate, suffocating volume of accurate artillery and the precise placement of the obstacles meant one thing. They had not found a weak seam. They had run face first into a highly organized, veteran defensive network. But the strategic imperative of the offensive allowed no detours. The supply routes behind Dom Bütgenbach had to be taken. Recognizing the roadblock, the German commanders made a fateful calculation. They pulled their battered vanguard back into the fog to regroup. They would not look for a way around. Instead, they would escalate, assembling a much heavier, coordinated armored fist to shatter the American lines with overwhelming brute force the very next morning. Before the sun even began to lighten the dense, freezing fog on the morning of December 20th, the deep, guttural thrum of Maybach 512 tank engines echoed through the Ardennes forests. The 12th SS Panzer Division was not retreating. They were doubling down. In the command posts operating just behind the German lines, the officers of the Hitlerjugend Division were staring at a strategic nightmare. The sweeping master plan of the 6th Panzer Army was already collapsing under its own weight. Miles behind the front, the narrow, unpaved logging roads of the Ardennes were choked with miles-long traffic jams of German armor, fuel trucks, and artillery, all stalled in the freezing mud. The strict timetable handed down by Adolf Hitler demanded that these spearheads cross the Meuse River within days. Instead, they were bleeding time they did not have. Field Marshal Walter Model and SS Commander Sepp Dietrich were exerting immense, crushing pressure on their frontline officers to clear the bottlenecks immediately. There was no time for subtle flanking maneuvers, no time for extended reconnaissance, and no room to bypass the American strongpoint at Dom Bütgenbach. The crossroads had to be seized. The German commanders, dismissing the previous day's ambush as a minor setback executed by a lucky rear guard, made a fateful, rigid decision. They ordered a massive, coordinated frontal assault. They would utilize their premier asset, the Panzerkampfwagen 5, the Panther tank, supported by heavily armed SS Panzer Grenadiers, to simply crush the American perimeter through overwhelming physical mass. On paper, the mathematics heavily favored the SS. The Panther was arguably the most lethal medium tank of the Second World War. Weighing 45 tons, it was equipped with heavily sloped frontal armor that was virtually immune to standard Allied anti-tank guns, and mounted a high-velocity 75mm cannon designed to destroy targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Out on the open steppes of the Eastern Front, this machine was a peerless hunter. But the men of the American 2nd Battalion were not going to fight on a flat, open plain, and they were certainly not going to engage the Panthers at 2,000 yards. Lieutenant Colonel Derrill Daniel had anchored his defense on a tactical concept known as the reverse slope. It is a profoundly counterintuitive way to fight. Basic military instinct dictates holding the high ground, placing your troops on the crest of a hill so they can see the enemy approaching and engage them at maximum distance. Daniel did the exact opposite. He ordered his infantry and anti-tank crews to dig in behind the low ridges surrounding the manor, effectively blinding his own men to the distant German movements. But this deliberate blinding served a lethal purpose. By positioning his forces on the reverse slope, Daniel entirely negated the Panthers' massive range advantage. The German optics were useless if they had no line of sight to the American positions. Furthermore, the tactic exploited a fundamental mechanical limitation of the German armor. When a tank drives up the front of a hill and breaches the crest, the chassis is angled upward. The main gun can only depress so far. For several agonizing seconds, as the tank rolls over the peak, its barrel is pointing uselessly at the sky, and its thinner, unsloped underbelly is briefly exposed. The tank is completely unable to fire at targets positioned low and close on the opposite side of the ridge. The Americans were not planning to fight a long-range duel. They were baiting the 60-ton Panthers into driving over the crests, forcing them into point-blank engagements at distances of less than 200 yards, where the heavy frontal armor mattered least, and where American weapons could actually penetrate the steel. As the morning of December 20th progressed, the gray silhouettes of the German assault force finally materialized out of the freezing mist. It was a textbook combined arms operation. The Panthers advanced at a steady, grinding pace, their wide tracks churning the frozen earth. Following closely behind and beside the armored beasts were the elite Panzer Grenadiers of the 25th and 26th SS regiments. The infantry's job was critical. They were the eyes of the tanks. They were there to protect the vulnerable flanks of the armor, to spot hidden anti-tank guns, and to flush out American infantry hiding in the snow. As long as the tanks and the infantry remained tied together in a single, cohesive unit, the German fist was virtually unstoppable. From their freezing observation posts in the upper windows of the Dom Bütgenbach estate, American artillery spotters watched the massive formation crawl toward the first ridgeline. They waited until the bulk of the German force was entirely committed to the open fields, entirely exposed without any natural cover. Then, they keyed their radio handsets. They did not call for armor-piercing rounds, and they did not target the heavily armored Panthers. They targeted the soft tissue surrounding the steel. They called for an artillery mission, utilizing a technology so highly classified, its use in ground combat had only been authorized mere days prior to the Battle of the Bulge. Within minutes, the sky above the advancing SS columns began to scream, but these were not standard artillery shells. In traditional barrages, high explosive shells are fitted with point-detonating fuses. They explode when they hit the ground. In the deep snow and freezing mud of the Ardennes, these ground bursts were often smothered, the earth absorbing a massive percentage of the deadly shrapnel, allowing infantrymen to survive by diving into shallow craters. But the shells arcing toward the 12th SS were equipped with the brand new POSIT, or variable time proximity fuse. Hidden inside the plastic nose cone of each shell was a miniature, incredibly fragile radio transmitter, powered by glass vacuum tubes, engineered to survive the violent 20,000 G acceleration of being fired from a howitzer. As the shell plummeted toward the battlefield, it constantly broadcast a continuous radio wave. When that wave bounced off the frozen ground and returned to the sensor, internal circuitry calculated the exact distance to the earth. Exactly 50 feet above the heads of the advancing German columns, the shells detonated automatically. The effect was apocalyptic. The proximity fuses transformed the barrage from a series of ground-level explosions into an inescapable, supersonic shower of jagged steel raining vertically downward. There was no cover. Diving to the ground offered no protection from an airburst detonating directly overhead. Foxholes became useless. The elite SS Panzer Grenadiers, caught entirely in the open, were subjected to a mechanical meat grinder. In a matter of minutes, the protective infantry screen was systematically shredded, pinned to the frozen earth, and completely decimated. The American artillery had achieved its primary objective, the surgical separation of the German combined arms team. The surviving infantry could not advance through the curtain of airbursts, but the Panthers, sealed inside inches of hardened steel, were largely immune to the shrapnel. Operating under rigid orders to secure the crossroads at all costs, and driven by the arrogant momentum of their initial push, the tank commanders made a fatal error. They did not halt and wait for their infantry to regroup. They kept driving forward, pushing through the wall of explosions, cresting the ridges, and rolling down into the American perimeter. In doing so, the character of the battle fundamentally shifted. Inside the cramped, freezing turrets of the Panthers, the German commanders peered through their thick glass episcopes and suddenly realized a terrifying truth. The fog was thick. The smoke from the artillery was blinding, and when they looked in their mirrors, the infantry was gone. A buttoned-up tank without infantry support is not a fortress. It is a blind, death metal box. The gunner, staring down the narrow tube of his primary optic, could only see a fraction of the battlefield directly in front of him. The driver, looking through a narrow armored slit, could only see the ground a few yards ahead. The noise of the massive Maybach engines and the grinding steel tracks completely drowned out all external sound. They could not hear the enemy moving. They could not see the enemy hiding in the snow. They were utterly alone, navigating blindly through a cratered lunar landscape directly into the teeth of the American reverse slope trap. As the massive Panthers lumbered down the reverse slopes, the American execution phase began. It was not a chaotic, desperate firefight. It was a synchronized dissection. Hidden in shallow, snow-covered foxholes, two-man American hunter-killer teams, armed with M9 bazookas, waited with terrifying discipline. They let the 60-ton machines drive past them, sometimes at distances of mere feet, feeling the seismic vibration of the tracks in their chests. They waited until the tanks exposed their thinner 40mm side armor or the vulnerable ventilation grates on their engine decks. Then they rose from the freezing mud and fired. The bazooka did not rely on the kinetic velocity of a heavy shell. It fired a shaped charge warhead. Upon impact, the explosive inverted a copper cone, creating a hypersonic jet of superheated metal that burned straight through the armor plate, spalling white-hot fragments into the crowded crew compartments, igniting ammunition racks, and severing hydraulic lines. Simultaneously, the American 57mm towed anti-tank guns, perfectly camouflaged in defilade positions, dropped their concealment nets. The crews had been under strict orders to hold their fire until the enemy armor had fully committed to the kill zone, completely unaware of their presence. Now, from flanking angles, the guns barked in rapid succession, creating a lethal web of crossfire. They slammed solid armor-piercing shot into the drive sprockets and the side sponses of the Panthers. Once a tank was hit and its track severed, it was immobilized, instantly transformed from a mobile predator into a static steel coffin. The meticulously engineered killing zone functioned flawlessly. One by one, the pride of the 6th Panzer Army was systematically dismantled. Panthers slewed sideways in the snow, throwing sparks and heavy steel links as their tracks shattered. Internal explosions blew open heavy armored hatches, sending plumes of thick, oily black smoke boiling into the freezing fog. German tank crews who managed to survive the internal fires bailed out of their burning machines, only to be ruthlessly cut down in the snow by concentrated, interlocking fire from American M1 Garand rifles and heavy Browning machine guns, positioned specifically to cover the anti-tank obstacles. The isolated tanks were effectively hunted, cornered by invisible enemies, and slaughtered. Yet the most chilling aspect of the battle was not the efficiency of the defense, but the stubborn, almost mechanical fanaticism of the SS attacks. The German commanders refused to accept the reality of the mathematical meat grinder they had driven into. Pressure from the high command was absolute. Failure was not a strategic option. Over the course of December 20th, the 12th SS Panzer Division did not launch just one assault. They regrouped in the fog, assembled fresh armor, and threw themselves at the Dom Bütgenbach perimeter in a relentless cycle. They launched 4 distinct major armored pushes against the 2nd Battalion's lines throughout the day. Each time, the German armor crested the ridges. Each time, the American forward observers called down the devastating proximity fuses to strip away the infantry. Each time, the blind Panthers rolled into the crossfire, and each time they were executed. But this mechanical perfection carried a horrific hidden cost for the defenders. The Americans were holding the line, but they were bleeding heavily in the process. The sheer physical and psychological strain of stopping 4 consecutive armored assaults in sub-zero temperatures was pushing the infantrymen to the absolute limits of human endurance. Frostbite was spreading through the ranks, turning toes and fingers black in the frozen boots and sodden gloves. Medical supplies were evaporating. Most critically, the logistical arteries of the battalion were being drained at an unsustainable rate. The voracious artillery batteries were burning through thousands of shells, and the frontline troops were watching their stockpiles of bazooka rockets and armor-piercing ammunition dwindled dangerously low with every repulsed attack. The defenders were trapped in a relentless, exhausting cycle of violence, constantly repairing blown communications wire under fire, constantly digging deeper into the frozen earth, constantly preparing for the next wave of Maybach engines to echo from the fog. By the time darkness finally fell on the evening of December 20th, the fields surrounding the shattered Dom Bütgenbach estate were a grotesque graveyard of charred, twisted metal. Over a dozen heavy German tanks sat burning in the snow, casting a flickering, hellish orange glow against the dense fog. The American defense had proven to be a masterpiece of calculated, geometric warfare. The 2nd Battalion had built a machine designed to grind heavy armor into scrap, and for 24 hours, that machine had functioned perfectly, absorbing the heaviest blows the SS could deliver without breaking. It was a fragile, delicate balance of restricted visibility, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and meticulously calculated engagement ranges. The perimeter held beautifully through the frozen, tense night. The mathematical equation of their survival remained intact. It held right up until the bleak morning of December 21st, when the parameters of the battlefield suddenly shifted and nature itself violently turned against the Americans. The dawn of December 21st did not bring light. Instead, the freezing mist that had cloaked the Ardennes thickened into an impenetrable, suffocating fog, rolling heavily across the fields. Visibility plummeted from a few hundred yards to less than 50 feet. In the upper floors of the estate, the American artillery spotters stared into a blank, white wall. The meticulous grid of pre-registered target reference points was gone. The eyes of the defense were completely blinded, and the mathematical perfection of the American killing zone instantly fell apart. The commanders of the 12th SS Panzer Division immediately sensed the shift. The devastating rain of proximity-fused artillery that had slaughtered their infantry the day before suddenly ceased falling with pinpoint accuracy. Seizing this tactical window, the Germans unleashed their heaviest assault yet. A massive wave of surviving Panthers, now reinforced by low-slung Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, materialized out of the whiteout. This time, their Panzer Grenadier escorts were not stripped away by airbursts. The German combined arms machine remained intact, and it drove straight into the blinded American outer perimeter. The calculated geometric defense collapsed into desperate, chaotic brawls. 60 tons of German steel rolled directly over the frozen foxholes of the 2nd Battalion. As the massive tracks churned the earth, they violently severed the buried communication wires linking the frontline platoons to the artillery and the command post. The intricate radio networks dissolved into frantic static. By mid-morning, the perimeter was fundamentally breached. German armor bypassed the shattered anti-tank guns and broke directly onto the manor grounds. The logistical arteries had finally run dry. American infantrymen, completely out of bazooka rockets and armor-piercing shells, were reduced to firing rifles at the impenetrable sloping armor of the Jagdpanzers. The German tank crews, operating with terrifying impunity inside the wire, began methodically pivoting their turrets, firing high-explosive 75mm shells point-blank into the surviving U.S. foxholes and the reinforced stone walls of the battalion command post. The tactical reality was undeniable. The perimeter had fractured, the enemy was inside the compound, and the battalion was being physically crushed under the treads. In his heavily battered command post, Lieutenant Colonel Derrill Daniel realized that every conventional option had been exhausted. With his lines overrun and his men moments away from total annihilation, the commander was left with only one desperate, unthinkable alternative. Through the static of the last surviving radio line, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel bypassed every standard safety protocol of American artillery doctrine. He transmitted a desperately modified set of coordinates directly to the fire direction centers, massed behind the Elsenborn ridge. He was not asking for a defensive barrage ahead of his lines. He was calling for a concentrated, maximum-effort strike dangerously close to, and in some sectors, directly on top of, his own overrun foxholes. He was ordering the artillery to wipe the grid square clean, gambling that his infantry, hunkered at the very bottom of their frozen craters, could miraculously survive the concussive shockwave that was about to erase the German armor operating just inches above them. Miles away, the American artillery network responded with terrifying mechanical efficiency. It was not just the battalion's dedicated 105mm howitzers that answered the call. The emergency transmission triggered a massive, coordinated coordinated response from the heavy 155mm batteries and corps-level artillery parks. The sky above Dom Bütgenbach did not just scream, it physically tore apart. What followed was an unprecedented storm of high explosives. In a matter of hours, the American batteries poured out over 10,000 heavy artillery shells onto the immediate perimeter of the estate. It was a staggering volume of fire, an impenetrable, deafening wall of steel and concussive force that transformed the foggy morning into a sensory nightmare. The ground heaved violently under the continuous, overlapping detonations. For the men trapped inside the command post and the surrounding trenches, the world dissolved into a blinding white flash of concussive pressure and suffocating cordite dust. Caught precisely at the epicenter of this industrial meat grinder, the German assault force instantly disintegrated. The Jagdpanzers and Panthers, which had been methodically dismantling the American defenses point blank, were suddenly engulfed in a saturation bombardment. The sheer, relentless concentration of heavy artillery physically shattered the surviving SS infantry right on top of the American lines. Armor plates buckled under direct hits from heavy shells. Tank tracks were blown apart. Engines were crippled by concussive shockwaves, and the highly coordinated combined arms assault dissolved into an absolute chaotic slaughter. The German offensive didn't just stall, it was pulverized by the sheer, overwhelming weight of industrialized firepower. When the American guns finally ceased their relentless pounding and the dense mixture of fog and smoke began to clear over the ruined estate, a chilling silence fell over the cratered landscape. The true scale of the carnage surrounding the battered manor was finally laid bare, revealing exactly what this brutal defense meant for the wider war. The defense of Dom Bütgenbach did more than save a single infantry battalion. It effectively secured the Elsenborn ridge. Because the 2nd Battalion held the vital crossroads, they permanently slammed the door on the northern wing of the Ardennes offensive. This localized anchor entirely derailed the rigid timetable of the 6th Panzer Army. Sepp Dietrich's elite armored spearheads were left hopelessly bottled up in the cramped logging roads, their momentum permanently shattered. Looking at the blackened ruins of the estate, the true historical significance of this engagement becomes clear. The 12th SS Panzer Division was not halted by mere stubbornness or cinematic heroism. They were systematically dismantled by the overwhelming, unforgiving reality of Allied industrial supremacy. The Panzer Grenadiers marched into the whiteout, armed with fanatical, ideological zeal and the heaviest armor on the battlefield. But ideological fanaticism cannot survive 10,000 rounds of high explosive, and 60 tons of steel cannot advance through an endless wall of proximity-fused artillery. The Americans survived because they engineered an environment that magnified their industrial strengths. They defeated a premier armored formation through the flawless execution of modern doctrine, relying on a seamless network of radio communications, a relentless logistical supply chain, and the devastating calculated efficiency of concentrated firepower. It was the absolute triumph of disciplined military mathematics over brute mechanized force. In the end, the freezing fog around the manor did not conceal an inevitable American slaughter. Instead, surrounded by the charred, snow-covered husks of ruined Panther tanks, Dom Bütgenbach stands as a stark monument to the brutal mechanics of modern warfare. The elite armor of the Third Reich came to crush an isolated infantry perimeter, but instead, they drove blindly into an airtight killing zone and found only a freezing, metallic graveyard. In the frozen mud of Dom Bütgenbach, the German war machine did not simply run out of fuel, time, or fanatical courage. It ran headfirst into the cold, calculated, industrialized reality of the American military. Victory at this crossroads was not decided by who possessed the heaviest armor or the most ruthless ideology, but by the unforgiving mathematics of massed artillery, buried explosives, and unbroken radio lines. When the winter fog finally lifted, the myth of an unstoppable armored breakthrough lay permanently shattered in the snow.